This lesson covers universal groups and how we configure the universal group membership. There are a number of different types of groups available to us in Active Directory. I can say a new group, I can say domain local or global. And these are both stored as objects within a specific domain. A universal group is available to every domain in the forest and can contain any users, any groups from any domain in the forest. So it's universally available. And this can't get stored in the typical way. This can't get stored in the domain partition because it has to be available to every domain controller. So behind the scenes, the way a universal group actually works is it's actually stored as part of the information that's replicated with a global catalog. So I can see here, I've connected to ADSI Edit and I've connected to the global catalog for my domain. So you do this by right-clicking ADSI Edit, connect to, and I'm still connecting to my regular domain naming context for my domain, but under Advanced, I'm selecting Global Catalog instead. So I'm now connecting to the GC instead of the regular Active Directory. So this allows me to actually go and see how those universal groups are being stored. So under Users, I could see my typical groups. And I can see, for example, I have Enterprise Admins. So the way this works is I can go and look at a universal group I've created. So I created Universal Justice Group. And if I look at the properties of this, I'll actually go and see the members of that group, even though it's part of the global catalog. So it's different from what you would typically see. This is how they get replicated around. Now in terms of managing these, it's managed like any other group. I create a universal security group and I just add people to it, but I can add groups and users from any domain in the entire forest. As I talked about in the previous lesson, to leverage universal groups, a global catalog must be contacted to ascertain a user's membership of universal groups. But let's take a scenario. I have a very, very large company, 100,000 users, and that company has lots and lots of different domains. And I'm a member of a very small subset domain. Maybe there's 500 people in my domain, and I'm in a branch location of that domain that has 20 users. So I have a domain controller for my small domain in that location. Now, for them to be able to log on and be able to get these universal groups, it would have to be able to contact a global catalog. But I don't want to actually install a global catalog at that tiny location because then it has to replicate those 100,000 objects. Now, it's only the partial attribute set. That's a lot of replication traffic for really very few times where it needs to get those universal groups. So what this would typically mean is, for the logon to function, a GC in another site would have to be contacted. But there's a great feature you can actually enable to cut down on that extra communication. I can go to a site, I expand it out, I select its NTDS site settings, select properties, and I can turn on Enable Universal Group Membership Caching. And I can even select which site I want to cache from. What this does is once I enable this functionality, a user still has to, the first time they log on, connect to another domain controller that is a global catalog. But the way it's actually working now is the domain controller in my local site is doing that communication for me, and it then caches that membership into a special attribute, an MSDS cached membership value. So it's now storing my universal group memberships in my local object. And it sets a timestamp as well, so it knows, well, how long before it should go and check again. This now means I can log on once, my local DC in my little 20-person site would go and contact a GC in another site, get my universal group memberships, and then cache them locally. So the next time I log on, it doesn't have to go and do that work again. So this is a great option to enable if you do have very, very small sites, you have a very large Active Directory, and you want to try and avoid some of that repeated work finding out those universal group memberships. So you can just check this feature, and it's now going to cache those memberships for you. Now, there are some attributes you can configure to say, well, how long do you want to keep that cached information for? But that's generally a far more advanced configuration, and the default value should suffice for most organizations. This concludes the lesson on universal groups and universal group memberships.